am a liberal feminist. I helped co-found the Muslim Reform Movement because I oppose the sexism and intolerance and extremism within the orthodoxy. So after the 9/11 attacks, I was fighting Islamism, this phenomenon of political Islam in the world. So for 20 years, chasing terrorists. And then over the last year, little did I know that I would become this accidental activist on the issues of education. But what happened is that in June 2020, after the tragedy of George Floyd's killing, the school principal at my son's high school sent an email to the moms and dads and kids at our school. And she said that we needed to check our privileges. And I thought, do you even know us?
When we talk about parents mobilizing against critical race theory, which is really this central ideology that's being taught in schools that you have such a huge issue with, what do we actually mean? What is critical race theory? And how does it affect the education of young people like your son, who was a senior in high school at the time of George Floyd's death?
We now have this notion that we have to look at, that it is critical to look at America and the world through the lens of race. We now have that translated into books like this one. This becomes this in our school system. This idea is presented to the young child. Whiteness is a bad deal, simply put. And then this illustration that you have a contract binding you to whiteness. You get stolen land, stolen riches, special favors. Whiteness gets to mess endlessly with the lives of your friends, neighbors, loved ones, and all fellow humans of color. Imagine now we are pitting a child as an enemy of their neighbor and even friend.
To me, this sounds quite religious. So it's sounding a little bit like original sin. How does your understanding of religion play into this idea of critical race theory?
Yeah, I was raised Muslim, and so the concept of original sin is not one in which we're born, but it is one that I know, defines so much of Christian thought. And this idea is very much one of original sin, that you are born with the sin of the race into which you are born. But the problem is, with this religion of wokeism, there is no forgiveness. There is no redemption. You must bend your knee to the idea that you are forever then the oppressor. And that is a heavy, heavy burden to put on any child. And so, the mama bear in me, it just says that this is child abuse.
When you protested the school board initially in 2020, you were dubbed a domestic terrorist, along with the other parents who were resisting critical race theory in Virginia schools. Why was that? And what does that actually mean?
So I went before my school board in June 2020. And we, as immigrants and parents of color, went before the school board that was now talking about anti-racism in our schools. They spent $20,000 for 1 hour with one of the architects of this anti-racism, a man by the name of Ibram X. Kendi. And for months and months before we were smeared as domestic terrorists, we were simply ignored. But we kept going. And the reason why the National School Board Association sent this letter as SOS to President Biden was because we weren't shutting up. So now they needed to silence us. But I just want to add one other element that's really important. There is a big business that is being supported by school board decisions and school district officials. It's a big business that is being that emerged over the last decade by big tech. And I only knew about this because our school district signed an agreement in September of this year with one of those companies. And that company is called Panorama Education. So what they did is that they used the social justice issues as a Trojan horse then to bring in something that they call screeners. And in these screeners, they ask kids questions like, do you feel loved? Do you feel suicidal? Are you non-binary, LGBTQ, transgender, gender fluid? And then they ask other questions like, do you feel like your race is represented in the school? So what has happened is that this company, for example, has gotten contracts with school districts all across America. And one of the investors is Mark Zuckerberg. What they do is then use the data to create algorithms on our kids and literally put them into a program that they called an early warning system. And in this early warning system, they then grade the kid as red, green, or yellow. And red means that the kid's is having problems and needs intervention. This is multi-million-dollar industry. And the person who wrote the letter that turned the FBI on parents was Attorney General Merrick Garland. We discovered that his son-in-law is one of the co-founders of this company, Panorama Education. And I just want to make sure that we talk about that element, because what has happened is that we have money and politics now intervening to have surveillance on our kids and intervene in our kids' lives. And that's when it became really serious.
How did the pandemic play into this narrative of the increase in critical race theory being taught in schools, and also in your fears around the school system in Virginia? How did the pandemic affect this?
With the pandemic, one serious issue was that school boards weren't dealing effectively with the crisis that we had of kids at home, and they were not managing well the idea of returning to school. So that was one big issue. Then secondly, what they did is, instead of focusing on this really important issue of how to get our kids back to school, they became social justice warriors. And so, like I mentioned, our school district, Fairfax County Public Schools, spent $20,000 to bring in this anti-racist, profit, when in fact, we needed them to get our kids back to school. And what they started doing is they started spending money on these programs, these trainings. They hired these, quote, diversity officers and brought in diversity consultants. I ended up helping create an organization called Parents Defending Education earlier this year. And one of my first tasks was to follow the money. And what happened, we started to see, is these big companies that are essentially government contractors ended up getting millions of dollars of contracts. We ended up being able to get accounting on $20 million of contracts of programs that include, the ideas of critical race theory, like and all their buzzwords. They're using all sorts of, cover stories like anti-racism, culturally responsive teaching, cultural pedagogy, all these fancy words, but it ends up becoming racism. But that's what it ends up boiling down to, racism and bigotry. And they started having affinity groups where they were literally segregating children by race. My beliefs as a Muslim feminist are ones that are aligned with liberal politics, right? But I am a classic liberal, and I refuse this politics of wokeism. People want to blame the right, but really there's this extreme left that is occurring. And as you know, it's happening in the UK, it's happening through Europe. And I just want to just make one point that's really important that kind of connects my intersectionality. The Islamists that are on the streets in the mosques in the UK and in the United States and in France, they are using critical race theory to racialize Muslims. And a lot of people will know how a lot of the Muslim extremists have used this smear of Islamophobia to shut people down when we talk about the very real issues of Islamic extremism. They are using this in order to have a cover for themselves. And this is something that we have to widen as we look at the real challenges and why we have to stand up, as you all are and your community does, and and leave the herd, because the herd mentality is going to be the death knell of the values that we believe so strongly in, related to free expression and critical thinking. And so I just hope that folks can connect the dots too on how this spills over into other really serious issues like terrorism.
Dancing in the flames, the people cursed his name, bowed at the altar of the father of lies. But there's a number to their days and all their evil ways. The Lord's gonna turn away from all their cries.